Well, it takes a brave man to cross the North London divide, as Sol Campbell found out when he made the switch from Spurs to Arsenal. Vinai Venkatesham is the latest to do it, James. Obviously, a former Arsenal CEO is going to take up the same job at Spurs at the end of the season. I mean, firstly, is that quite a big surprise for the London reporters? And what do we know about him?
Yeah, I think it is a surprise. I mean, he left Arsenal on good terms, and I know that in the intervening period, he's had offers from other clubs and he's turned them down. He was recently appointed to the new Wembley Stadium Advisory Group. That was sort of, I think, spoke to his skill set really that became quite effective during his 14 years at Arsenal. I mean, he held I think 6 different roles in that time, but you know, he probably made the biggest impact in terms of the sort of commercial side of things, sponsorship agreements, and that was kind of part of his life before he got into football. And I think that's obviously an area that Spurs will look to exploit when he comes in the summer. But I mean, as you say, there are not many players who make that cross that divide. Certainly not many executives either. And he sort of kept his options open for quite some time. Very highly regarded within the game. But yeah, he's often sort of spoken privately about how he's able to keep a relatively low profile when he was at Arsenal, even though he had obviously a very prominent position. You know, he could travel on the train to games and he wouldn't often get bothered and that sort of stuff. I suspect he might not be doing that for the first few weeks when he's going into North London on the other side.
I mean, just in terms of what he achieved at Arsenal, obviously we've seen that on the pitch, Arsenal have kind of turned themselves around under Mikel Arteta, and Arteta himself has got a lot of credit for that. But just how important has Venkatesham been, or how important was he to that transformation? Because obviously it's one thing doing it on the pitch, but it all starts, doesn't it, from how you're organised off the field? Yeah,
I think he's the glue that binds it all together, really. If you think about it, there's various sort of examples of this. He was very important in developing the women's team, and he asked people to implement sort of an external company to come in and essentially overhaul the way that the Arsenal women's team was structured, the operational side of it, hiring extra medical staff, support staff. And he had the aspiration of the women's team playing all of their games at Emirates Stadium. And, obviously that's something that they play regularly there now. And they're one of the most successful women's teams around. And, so he's had that impact. But also on the men's side, he was very sort of central to how their club hierarchy sort of grew organically and successfully. And to sort of explain that, he, as I say, he held 6 different positions in his 14 years. He ended up being chief executive at the end. But what grew around him was obviously Arsene Wenger left the club, autonomous figure. Unai Emery came in as head coach, had that kind of remit stripped back from manager to head coach. Then Arteta succeeded Emery, and it kind of grew back towards being sort of an old school manager, really, if you like, with far-reaching powers straight into the board. And alongside that, they appointed their first ever sporting director in 2019 in Edu. And Vinai Venkatesham appointed both of those men. And how that kind of grew over time, where Arteta grew in confidence, grew in authority, and Edu grew into that role as well, and the club really felt their way into that structure, it was a very atypical setup. So Vinai would sit at the top of it, and then Arteta would report into him directly, and Edu would also report into him directly. And it doesn't normally work like that at clubs. It would go manager or head coach into sporting director into chief executive. But he had that kind of collaborative approach, and he's a very intelligent, very thoughtful, very genial guy who was able to sort of mould all that together and sort of manage the different voices, manage the egos, if you like, to some extent, and really create a culture of progress at that club that allowed Arteta to thrive and grow, and obviously in his first managerial role become what he's been in the last 2 years, which is the main sort of challenger to Pep Guardiola until obviously Arne Slot came in at Liverpool. And then also to facilitate the growth in the women's game and the operational things at London Colney.
Beth, just going to come to you. I mean, obviously, hiring a new CEO doesn't get the heart racing, perhaps as a new centre forward or central midfielder. But obviously, covering Liverpool, you probably know better than anyone how important it is for clubs to get it right off the field. And Liverpool have had a little bit of a reshuffle, haven't they, recently? And obviously been fantastic on the field. But how important was, or the setup of Liverpool, how important has that been to how they've been able to see some success under Arne Slot this season?
Yeah, I think Liverpool's sort of setup behind the scenes was fundamental to the success under Jurgen Klopp. And I actually think when there was sort of a dissolution, I guess, of that really rigid structure, that's when things started to go a little bit awry for Liverpool in terms of recruitment. Michael Edwards, who has been sort of revered, he was sporting director at Liverpool. He now works a different role for FSG, but he left the club. His successor, Julian Ward, left the club, and it left Liverpool in a position where in the summer of 2023, they had an interim sporting director in Jörg Schmadtke, and that is probably the summer where the three out of contract players, obviously we now know that Mohamed Salah has signed, we think Van Dijk will as well, but that sort of vacuum of power, I guess, was allowed to happen, which I think just shows you how fundamental it is that you do have those structures in place at these big clubs. And that was something very much that FSG tried to do last season. When Jurgen Klopp announced that he was leaving, it was very much about getting a sporting director in Richard Hughes, and it was then his job to find Klopp's successor, which he did in Arne Slot. And Michael Edwards has come back, as I said, to FSG. So I think Liverpool now are reverting to the roots, I guess, in a way, in bringing in those figures behind the scenes. So yeah, I think for Tottenham, it's going to be key. And, as James said earlier on, I think Vinai's work with the women's team at Arsenal has been sort of transformational for the club. And I think Tottenham are in a position now where, the women's team probably isn't the priority when you look at how the men's team is doing, but certainly, it's an asset to the club and an aspect that could be elevated, I guess. And I think that's something that, for Tottenham fans and Tottenham women's fans, that could be quite exciting going forward.
James, are we expecting this to be one big change in a summer of change at Spurs? Obviously, the pressure is growing on Ange after a miserable season domestically, obviously still in the Europa League, but is it looking like there's going to be a change of manager to come with a change of CEO?
Well, the issue that's going on in the background here is the potential sale of Tottenham to a new ownership. And there's a lot we can't say about it at the moment. My understanding is that if there is a sale, that Daniel Levy will remain in charge. What we don't know at the moment is whether the new ownership will either want to put in someone alongside Daniel or maybe even above Daniel to try and influence some of the day-to-day decisions, or whether they will continue to give Daniel Levy the authority that he's had for 20-odd years with ENIC and carry on running the club how he wants. Because obviously, if a new ownership comes in, more often than not, experience tells you they kind of want their own manager. They tend to want their own guy at their helm. That would be further writing on the wall for Ange Postecoglou. I think if he doesn't win the Europa League, I can't see how he stays in the job. It could come a lot sooner than that. If they get knocked out of that competition, you could argue, is there any point keeping him until the end of the season, given where they are in the league? So it's just another sort of level of uncertainty that will not help Postecoglou as he desperately tries to rescue this season. I think there will be changes at the executive level going forward. We're yet to sort of see exactly how Vinai is going to fit into the structure. But, they've got Scott Munn there, who's been doing a lot of the commercial deals, only recently appointed. I think he only went in last summer. You'd have to say, do they necessarily need him if Vinai is going to come in and have that remit? If he's not, then you can see Scott staying. But there are sort of questions to answer there. And the more voices there are wanting to make their impact felt, wanting to stamp their authority on the club, the harder it's going to be for Postecoglou, I think, to keep his job.
Are you, from the outside, do you think that Ange deserves more time, or is it looking like the end? And if it is the end, is there anyone in particular you'd like to see taking that job at Spurs?
Oof, that's a big question. I do feel a little bit sorry for Ange in the sense that, the injuries that they've had, have just been ridiculous. And you've seen sort of moments this season where his brand of football, you've seen it clearly, you've seen his vision for the team. And when it works, it's fantastic, but it just hasn't worked enough. And I think sort of when you look at how fractious things have become, even with maybe the fans, and I know James, you were at the game, weren't you, when he sort of cupped his ear to the fans, and he obviously came out and he said that he didn't mean it in that way, but it just feels like maybe it just sort of feels like it's a little bit too far gone now for Ange, and I think probably it's best for all parties to maybe cut ties this summer. Obviously, if he wins the Europa League, maybe that's a different thing, but in terms of people coming in to replace him, it's such a hard job, isn't it? I mean, so many people have tried, and they've tried so many different types of managers. They've gone for sort of the tried and trusted in Mourinho, which obviously was a bit of a disaster. Conte as well. I know Iraola is one name that's been touted, and it'd be interesting to see how he fared, with the greatest respect to Bournemouth, a bigger club, I guess. But ultimately, it sort of feels like Tottenham have ruined managers over the past few years. So I think for people like Iraola, you maybe would be slightly wary of going there at the moment while things are still in flux behind the scenes. But yeah, it certainly sounds like it's going to be a big summer for them.
Yeah, but Beth's right. I mean, the two names that they've discussed internally are Marco Silva at Fulham and Iraola at Bournemouth. I think Thomas Frank probably is in that conversation as well. But I think it's Silva and Iraola are the two that, if it's Daniel Levy's decision and his alone, I think those are the two names that they would turn to first. But I think with Postecoglou, the situation really is that for someone who is actually a very effective and open communicator before games, not so much after games, because he can, the whole staring at the floor and not really looking at you and growling and for 3 minutes and being a bit irritated and then walking off. That, a lot of people see that. But I see him for sort of 30, 35 minutes before games when he's open, he takes questions from everywhere, takes them on, answers them at face value. But for somebody who's such a good communicator, he's lost control of the message at Spurs. And that whole thing about I didn't cut my ears, I just wanted to hear them chant, and cheer because we'd scored a goal was just a ridiculous attempt to backtrack. It was obvious what he was doing, and it again would be understandable because he's felt under a lot of pressure. He made a substitution that was criticised, and within 5 minutes, the guy he brought on scores. Of course, the goal, sadly for him, is ruled out by VAR, but you can understand why he'd think. An openly emotional man, as he admits himself, would think, actually, I do want to give a bit back here, and I do know what I'm doing, and get behind the team. And I think if he'd sort of owned that and kind of been as honest as he has been in other situations, then I think he could have ridden that out. But by sort of backtracking on it, and then a few days later, sort of suggesting there's a mole who's leaking information about the team, it just adds to that sense of the manager not being in control of the first team affairs. And when you combine that with the sort of disgruntlement of the fans, which, by the way, is still mostly aimed at Daniel Levy, it's not actually aimed at Postecoglou. He's kind of turned the guns on himself a bit there when he didn't really need to. And then you factor in the sort of rumours you hear about whether one or two of the players are sort of unhappy with the no-nonsense, never compromise approach of all-out attack and, we go for it, that's who we are, that kind of thing. You put it all together, and it is very difficult to see how he stays on.
Well, James, just end with you then. I mean, Tottenham obviously see themselves as a consistent qualifier for the Champions League. They've clearly got a Champions League stadium, but is the gap between where they are now and where they think they should be, is that as simple as bridged with a new CEO and a new manager, or are the issues just running far deeper than that?
Well, there is this misnomer that Spurs have not spent money in the market. I mean, they have. They spent 60-odd million on Solanke. They spent 40-odd million on Pedro Porro. They've committed significant sums to. I would just pluck two names out of there, but you could throw in Richarlison. You can throw in a lot of names there of where they've committed big money, Romero, Van der Ven, on these signings, and not enough of them have worked out. And I don't think the new CEO is going to be in charge of recruitment. He wasn't at Arsenal, and I don't think he will be now. They've had Fabio Paratici, who was obviously involved there. He then had the ban, but from what you hear, he still might be at least providing the advice as far as he can within the rules of the game. You've got Johan Lange, who's also there as a sporting director, who's obviously got his technical director. He's got his own influence over recruitment. That Spurs need to be braver with their recruitment. They need to not just shop in the cheaper end of the market and the younger end of the market, thinking about potential resale value. It was a frustration that several managers have had. Think about Antonio Conte, think about Jose Mourinho, managers who want players ready to win here and now. And I'm not suggesting they go and sign Kevin De Bruyne or a load of sort of 30-plus players who, could do it for a year or so, because then you sort of end in a kind of Casemiro situation. But what I'm saying is, they need to balance their recruitment better and not be always thinking about tomorrow. That's the problem with Tottenham. They've always thought about tomorrow. It's sensible financial planning. We build a fantastic stadium for the future. We build a great training ground for the future. We sign young players for the future. But there comes a point where managers want to win now. The fans want to win now. They don't pay their season ticket in a year's time. They pay for it now because they want to watch that team win now. And they need that win now mentality in their recruitment. That's the biggest change they need to make.